that the underlying principles of our government will not be greed, will not be kleptocracy, will not be hatred or violence.
Watch out, Washington. We the people are coming to take back Congress. And we're bringing with us some big ideas like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal. We did it in New York. We did it in Minnesota. We're doing it on the national stage, and now we're bringing that voice back to San Francisco. My name's Shahid Buttar. I'm running for Congress. I'm an immigrant. I'm a Muslim. I grew up in rural Missouri. When I was 16 years old, my family lost our house as I graduated from high school. I got my undergrad degree while working full-time after 10 years of night school. Then I went to Stanford to study and teach law. I've fought for your rights for 20 years, from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. as a constitutional lawyer, policy advocate, writer, educator, and grassroots organizer. And now I'm running to serve the people of San Francisco by fighting corporate corruption in Congress. We don't have the corporate cash that's kept Nancy Pelosi in office for 30 years. In fact, we just don't take corporate money. That's why we're mobilizing the community, meeting in living rooms and neighborhood centers, why we're out in the streets fighting for change, demanding universal health care, fighting for your children and grandchildren's right to a future free from climate crisis and a government for, of, and by the people instead of the 1%. A voice for school teachers, working class families, and immigrants, the 99%. This movement is just getting started. After 30 years of the same representation, San Francisco deserves a champion willing to return our city to the front lines of the progressive movement. Our city stands for inclusion and pride, peace and justice, and environmental sustainability. We can't wait another 30 years for our leaders to evolve on climate change. Delay is no better than denial. The time for action was yesterday. America is the only advanced country in the world where getting sick can leave you homeless, and higher education buries people in debt for the rest of their lives. The only voices we need in Congress are ones who will take action to fix that. You have a choice. Either let profit-driven corporations destroy our future, or instead vote to reclaim this country for the people. Vote for Shahid Buttar in the March 2020 primary, and join our campaign in the meantime. We can protect the future, and we must. I'm Shahid Buttar. I approve this message, and I invite your support.
Give a quick rundown of your biography for the new people.
I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm a movement strategist. I work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I trained and taught at Stanford Law School 20 years ago. And since then, I've done a bunch of things. I filed the first marriage equality case in the state of New York in 2004. My client there was the then mayor of New Paltz, New York, Jason West. I led a nonprofit called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee for 6 years. It's now known as Defending Rights and Dissent, and I sit on the board of that organization. The Bill of Rights Defense Committee was founded to fight the Patriot Act, and so the area of work in which I have been deepest over the last decade has been fighting government surveillance from the NSA to the Mayberry Police Department. I was a named plaintiff, rather our organization that I led was a named plaintiff in the First Unitarian Church versus NSA. That was a lawsuit in which we were represented by EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, before the organization hired me to join the staff. I also have, for instance, organized amicus briefs defending the right to trial in the face of an indefinite detention regime that shreds the presumption of innocence. I've organized thousands of lawyers and doctors and teachers to seek executive accountability for CIA officials under the Bush administration who were complicit in human rights abuses. We were seeking their accountability, particularly through state bar associations. I worked on, just recently, San Francisco became the first local jurisdiction in the country to deny access to face surveillance technology for government agencies, including police departments. I worked on that reform. I advocated for it before the board. I worked on the campaign that led up to it for the decade preceding it. And maybe the last thing I'll say on just, with respect to my bio, well, maybe a couple other pieces is the last thing I'll say about my work at EFF. I wrote a law in 2009 that has been adopted in part by jurisdictions around the country. The one that adopted it in greatest part is Providence, Rhode Island. which in the Providence Police Community Relations Act adopted a number of civil rights protections that I synthesized in 2009. I'm also an artist. I'm an MC, a poet, and a DJ. I organize artists. So there are 3 organized collectives of political artists, one in Palo Alto, one in San Francisco, one in Washington, D.C., that I launched between 2002 and the beginning of 2004. All of them remain active today. And then the last thing I will say is I think I am the only congressional candidate in the history of the Republic who's both been invited to brief members of Congress and their aides about proposed reforms while also having been arrested in the Senate for an act of journalism. I'm happy to talk about any and all of those things.
Yeah, I remember the last time we spoke to you, we did speak a lot about your work at the EFF. And one thing, we did ask our community for a few questions for you, just to kind of crowdsource it a little bit, because we asked you a lot of questions last time. One person asks here, where did this go? From Jameson, what degree do you think anonymity is important online? Do you think that's kind of possible? Do you think that's kind of exacerbating some of the online extremism that we're seeing? Or do you think that's even possible with the monopolistic powers of some of these organizations right now?
It's a good question. Anonymity is a crucial principle for the preservation of speech. And we talk in digital security about threat models. And so the locus or the arena in which anonymity is problematic is when we talk particularly about online harassment. And that's a real legitimate problem. One reason why digital civil liberties groups, including EFF, have shied away from embracing government regulation of that kind of behavior is particularly that when the government undermines anonymity, it kills democracy. It's not very different than the syllogism with respect to surveillance, but when people know they're being watched, they silence themselves. And when people know that they can't be anonymous, they are often unwilling to share perspectives that they might otherwise espouse. And so at the same time that anonymity can lend itself, for instance, to online trolls, and that's a real problem, I think, for instance, about the issues that Brianna Wu and others have thoughtfully brought to the political mainstream. And at least at EFF, the argument with respect to anonymity in that context is always focused on community self-moderation. But the real concern I have with respect to anonymity is ensuring that we retain access to it so that vulnerable people can raise their voices without fear of reprisal, either by the government or their employers or their neighbors or their spouses or potential future employers. There are any number of threats to speech when personal identity is necessarily tied to our speech. And that's one reason why anonymous speech has always had in our country such strong First Amendment constitutional protection.
Yeah. And a lot of, I hate to do the right-wing framing of talking about the founding fathers, but anonymous speech was important to the development of our own political economy here in the U.S. And, a lot of it's part of the tradition of American, dissent is doing it from the protection of anonymity. So I think that makes a lot of sense and is important for everybody in the community who's watching this to understand. And so one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, not to jump too much around, because we did cover a lot the last time around, was how the campaign is going. Obviously you are facing the most powerful Democrat in the U.S. House, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, somebody who has basically been ahead of a machine in San Francisco for decades, and I assume has her, has strict, strong control about what goes on in the city of San Francisco. So how are the people of San Francisco reacting? What do your volunteers look like? And how's the support both locally and nationally?
Yeah, great questions. We are certainly confronting a hard target in the Speaker of the House. I wouldn't say she has a lot of control over what happens locally, only because neither she nor her staff are frequently here. She's much more focused on Washington than San Francisco, and therein lies the case precisely. Our city hasn't had a representative in Washington in the better part of a decade because the person who is elected to be our representative is instead more focused on representing a particular party rather than our city. And San Francisco stands well to the left of the Democratic Party. And that gulf, that chasm, I think is why we've received such an outpouring of support from across the city, across the Bay Area, across the state, frankly, across the entire country. We've attracted 4,500 donors from every one of the 50 states, including DC, well, plus DC and Puerto Rico. Our endorsements have been swelling. They recently include one of the former presidents of our Board of Supervisors, who nearly became mayor in 2003. That's Matt Gonzalez. Another former supervisor, Eric Marr. Our endorsers include Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of Code Pink, Women for Peace. They include Lawrence Lessig, the internet law and political process corruption luminary. They include Vets for Bernie and Bay Area for Bernie, and they also include 3 of Bernie's surrogates, Linda Sarsour, who is the co-founder of the Women's March, Sean King, the renowned journalist covering, among other things, the movement for Black Lives, and Dr. Cornel West, who has no comparison. The endorsements of those figures and those organizations, the outswelling of support from the donor base, both indicate some of their objective indications of the momentum that we've been building. With respect to volunteers, we have thousands, actually, of people who have signed up to volunteer. Most of them don't live in the Bay Area. They also are coming from around the country. In the Bay Area, we have about 250 volunteers. Our biggest challenge at the moment, frankly, is coordinating among those people who are kicking in their time and talent. At any given moment on the campaign, there are probably 2 to 3 dozen of those volunteers actively engaged in. Some of the project teams that the volunteers are standing up include press outreach. They include coordinating private events at the homes of supporters. Our front-facing website design team is all volunteers. On Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, we have teams of volunteers. So there's a lot of different opportunities. Remote volunteers are also helping us with data entry, graphic design. There's a whole litany of ways in which our campaign is, frankly, running on a great deal of volunteer support at the same time that we are pulling in the resources that we'll need to mount a citywide campaign, both for the primary next March, and I'm very confident that we'll be in until the general next November.
So one thing I want to ask you, got a number of different questions like this, because we do have a handful of people watching who, they're activists in the local Bay Area, and, some of them are already familiar with you, some aren't, but had a handful of questions. I'm going to kind of combine them all together here. But, Nancy Pelosi seems pretty disconnected from the district overall. Like, it really doesn't seem there's a correlation between the values of that San Francisco district and what she stands for specifically in Congress.
That's right.
And one thing a number of people were asking, like, what are some, San Francisco specific policies that, you really want to push for? I know housing is, I used to live there myself. I know housing is always a huge issue there, but what are some issues that you just feel like speak directly to San Francisco?
Well, I almost hear 2 different questions there. There's what is the local dimensions of our policy platform, but just in terms of what are the issues I've worked on that are very near and dear to the heart of our city, I would start with marriage equality. Our city is one of the meccas of the LGBT community in the world. I was a very early advocate in that movement long before most Democrats showed up to support the rights of my neighbors. Speaker Pelosi didn't support marriage equality for LGBTQ couples until not very long before a decision by a right-wing Supreme Court that obviated the need for her support. She basically showed up after the battle was won. I was fighting on the very leading edge of that struggle as a cis hetero Muslim lawyer, because I recognize what intersectionality means, both as it pertains to oppression and as it relates to liberation. And the intersectional nature of my liberation praxis, I think, is also independently aligned with the city's sensibilities. In 2003, I was one of about 20,000 San Franciscans who seized the city nonviolently and laid siege to it the night that Bush invaded Iraq, the morning after. And we held the city nonviolently for 36 hours, ensuring that business did not happen in San Francisco. The entire downtown was dark that day because we blocked all the bridges and the exit ramps off the highways. That kind of bold, assertive, direct action to defend human rights principles, to fight climate chaos, and to contain executive power run amok, all of which were implicated in the invasion of Iraq, I think very clearly demonstrated how my political roots emerge very much from San Francisco's political sensibility. I would say also, as long as we're on the subject, my organizing among artists is quintessentially San Francisco. I've been occupying public space with politicized performance art for 20 years. And that is very reflective of the district's sensibility. San Francisco is also a city that has long been committed to climate justice. And I see this reflected in our platform, particularly in the context of our commitment to a Green New Deal and Speaker Pelosi's choice to deride the Green New Deal as a dream. And
the green dream.
The green dream, exactly. And I'm very concerned about the climate crisis. And I want to make clear that it's not a future problem. It is a current problem. It has already killed Californians. And the next time there is a series of devastating wildfires, more Californians very well might die. And those are climate-driven catastrophes, separate from the weather events, which are also increasing in frequency and severity. And so the Green New Deal, as an expression of the city's political value set, is another position of which I'm proud. And let's ground that maybe to bridge to your second question. How does that relate to the city itself now, separate from the values, but how do the platform planks intersect our city on the ground? So one of them, just to talk about the Green New Deal, a Green New Deal in San Francisco has to look like, at the very beginning, a real effort to clean up Hunters Point. Hunters Point is a neighborhood in the southeast corner of the city. It's one of our few remaining African-American enclaves. It's the site of a former Navy shipyard where the Navy dumped toxic chemicals for decades. And there is a corporate contractor that was tasked with cleaning up that toxic waste. We discovered in multiple different points in time that the soil samples that were relied upon in that cleanup effort were falsified. Basically, it was a fraudulent cleanup effort. There are still people who live in that neighborhood, and the cancer rates are through the roof. And the Green New Deal has to look like addressing instances of environmental racism. I'm very proud to be endorsed, among other people, by the head of the California Environmental Justice Alliance. And one of the reasons I think that she endorsed us is precisely because we have long stood in solidarity with communities that are battling, whether it's the overtly authoritarian efforts of government agencies and police, or whether it's the predatory work of corporations that put their profit before people. But in each of those contexts, I'm very eager to stand in solidarity with my neighbors. You asked how the platform would hit the ground. We talked about the Green New Deal in Hunters Point. I want also to mention affordable housing. You raised it, but it is very much the central political issue in San Francisco and the Bay Area, particularly because our city and the surrounding region has endured some of the most exorbitant price escalations in real estate and in rents of anywhere in the country and even, frankly, the world. And one of the reasons for that is because the federal government, which used to invest substantial sums in affordable housing, basically block grants that created incentives for property developers to create affordable units when they build new buildings. The federal pipeline for those projects has dried up entirely. Speaker Pelosi's tenure happens to coincide with the particular collapse of this program. And, a lot of people describe her as a master legislator. I will concede the point. I think she is a master legislator. I just think her record reveals that she has not been a master legislator on San Francisco's behalf. Instead, she's been much more allied with Wall Street, much more allied with the Pentagon, with weapons contractors. And that's exactly the commitment that I would hope to flip and invert to make sure that our city's voice in Washington is instead aligned with our city's values.
Yeah, it sounds really good, Shahid. But the one thing that concerns me, and I'm somebody on the electoral side of organizing, and I've seen this happen with promising progressive candidates where they have a clear path to victory, they have that opportunity to win.
Yeah.
But it seems like every stumbling block that could possibly be generated is thrown in front of them. And the interest groups, the progressive groups that we count on for solidarity don't end up showing up out of fear. Is that a concern of yours, or are you not worried about the support of national progressive groups and you can feel like you can win this even without them?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I guess, are you thinking of like the Justice Democrats and brand new Congresses of the world? Is that kind of who you're talking about?
Justice Democrats, Our Revolution, you name it. Are they going to find the courage to support you, do you think? Or are Are you working hard for those kind of endorsements, or are you really based in a San Francisco-based movement?
Well, I'm running for a congressional seat representing San Francisco, and so yeah, my focus is very much local. As I look to the national groups, I can't really make a blanket statement about them. Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress are two groups that are very closely identified with particular members of Congress, and I think they feel, perhaps rightly so, that if they were to endorse in our race, they might place their allies on the Hill at risk of basically recrimination by the Speaker. Right. And I totally understand it. Our revolution is much less identified with members of Congress, and I do feel confident, having gotten the endorsements of both of the local Our Revolution groups in the last cycle when I ran against Pelosi and got more votes against her than anyone from the left in a primary in a decade. After only 3 months in the race, without any media attention, and now we have a year and still 3 months before the November general election in 2020, we're getting a ton of media attention. We're getting a ton of support, volunteers, a lot of support that was not there last year. And in that context, yeah, I'm very confident, frankly, about both the primary and the general election, particularly because Speaker Pelosi has been so unfortunately allied with the Trump administration that for all intents and purposes, she's been campaigning on our behalf. And right. I expect that to continue. If she chooses at some point to demonstrate some independence from our criminal president and instead to start promoting progressive interests, I think we will have a harder road to victory in that case. And frankly, I'd be thrilled for that to happen. I would love for her to show up for the progressive causes that she has chosen instead to abandon in the last decade. And maybe the last thing I'd say just about the national groups is, having been endorsed by Vets for Bernie, having been endorsed by Bay Area for Bernie, there's another group that is currently preparing an endorsement, which I'll leave unnamed for the moment. I think we will be getting a lot of support from many national groups, notwithstanding those that might be chilled from endorsing due to their own calculus about the risks that they would incur on their other supporters if they do.
Yeah, and sorry for the tactical questions. I know those don't always interest people. It's just, from an organizer point of view, there's two parts. You have the ideas and you have to actually get it done. And that involves finding people that are going to support you, and those are going to stay ambivalent for their own calculation. And it's always good to know where people stand. And this is obviously
the difference between careerists and movement people, frankly. Right. I mean, what you're pressing on is like anyone with a political career will be very chilled from supporting us. In fact, I spoke with a member of a state legislature who, despite having served 17 years in office, they said to me, "I love you. I love what you're about. I love what you stand for. I want you to win. I dare not support you because she will end my career." That was the statement from a member of a state legislature. And that reveals the chilling effect that the speaker is able to impose on people within and outside the party that are interested in our race. You might describe that as a profound reflection of an anti-democratic sensibility, ironically, from the head of the Democratic Party. Another thing, though, that I would say here is that at the same time that careerists have been predictably chilled from supporting us, people in the movement, that is to say movement organizations, individuals, networks, have been incredibly supportive. And frankly, right. that's how we did as well as we did in 2018. That's really been the base that we've been springing from in 2020. We've been all over the abolish ICE, close the camps actions here in San Francisco, all the way down to Palo Alto, where Palantir is based. We've been very active promoting impeachment and executive accountability on the street, online, in the press. Aside from drawing blood on Pelosi's complicity with Trump's human rights abuses and her unwillingness to seek executive accountability for his litany of continuing crimes, other issues where we've been drawing blood include Speaker Pelosi's unfortunate commitment to a corporate extractive healthcare model that kills Americans every day instead of recognizing healthcare as a human right and providing access to it for everyone. Another issue we've been drawing blood on is Speaker Pelosi's unwillingness to stand with the climate justice movement. Every time the Sunrise Movement or Extinction Rebellion or the Youth Climate Strike has had an action in San Francisco over the last year, we've been there. When we occupied the ICE office both last summer and this year, not only was there, but I had a chance to share music with those crowds and to use my art to support the grassroots mobilizing in favor of human rights. So in the social movement sphere, other social movements that are included and that are supporting us include the immigrant rights movement, the movement for Black Lives here locally, students and young people alarmed at the way in which millennials were fleeced in the 2008 financial crisis. We don't yet have formally the DSA chapter's endorsement, but I expect to secure that soon as well. And I think you see in the movement voices frankly, a clamoring for the campaign. I mean, I've been frankly stunned at the support that's been pouring out. We have signs up all over the city already, and we're a year out from the election. The endorsements are coming in faster and more prolifically than they did last year. So I'm very confident. And I appreciate the tactical questions, particularly because I think they reveal why we are so well positioned to liberate the seat. It's precisely because so many San Franciscans and so many Americans well beyond our city recognize the increasingly dire need for us to shrug off the failures of the past in order to embrace and defend the future.
One other question that's been popping up here, and we know you don't have too much time, but someone was asking, what are some of your artistic inspirations and influences? Because you are an artist yourself, and you've helped organize artists, but just kind of curious.
Chuck D is at the top of my list, the founder of Public Enemy. He is a rapper. He is a visionary. He's someone who used art to educate, inspire, and mobilize. I see a lot of other artists like that. Moby is one in the electronic music community that maybe is a little bit closer to my musical sensibility. Bass Nectar was an artist in the dubstep community, which is not a sound I particularly appreciate, but he's a very political actor as a music producer in that space. Ross Couch is a music producer whose work, both aesthetically and substantively, appeals to me. I'll name drop Speech from Arrested Development is another insightful visionary MC. And then you can go back to like the KRS-Ones of the world, Grandmaster Flash. A lot of the early era of conscious liberatory hip hop is what inspired me when I was a young man in Chicago. And that really molded my understanding of art as a vehicle to challenge power on behalf of people. And that's really informed my use of art, both as an artist myself and as an organizer of artists ever since.
Yeah, it's amazing, because one of the things that I'm struck by, and so many of our viewers, is they're humbled by all the hard work and activism that you've done in your life, and it's inspiring to everybody that you have this energy and this drive. And I think a lot of people, and I want to say personally, thank you for doing this, because the one issue that we have in our political, the political environment that we all deal with is a hemmed in political horizon.
Yes.
And everybody, it's like the Green New Deal you brought up earlier. Bernie Sanders recently published his Green New Deal plan. Mm-hmm. And the biggest argument isn't whether or not it's necessary, it's needed, or it'll be effective. It's always this political horizon question of, we can't do it.
Yes.
What do you think it's going to take for our country to change from, a nation of mini pundits to an organized society that's fighting for change? And also, what do you think of Bernie's plan?
Yeah, I'm all in for Bernie, first of all. And there are a whole range of areas where several of his more recent policy proposals are especially closely aligned with ours. One of them is his vision for criminal justice reform. We put out a crim justice reform proposal last year in 2018. 30 points, incredibly expansive, visionary. It's basically a remix of the demands of the movements for Black lives and immigrant rights. And I see many of its principles reflected in Bernie's more recent proposal. 20 years ago, I wrote a paper about radical wealth redistribution within the context of a market society, particularly by isolating trusts and estates reform. And Bernie's estate tax plan doesn't exactly hew so close to the particular proposal that I crafted 20 years ago, but it very much takes inspiration from the same set of concerns. Those are just a couple examples of sort of where I see the alignment between our particular perspectives. On the point you raised about my history of activism, it's very kind of you, and it's kind of everyone else. I appreciate it. I will say this, as a constitutional lawyer who is a Muslim immigrant, I've never had a choice.
Right.
I mean, the revolution came to me. I didn't go seeking it. I mean, the authoritarianism revealed itself unapologetically as it pertains to my community 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I'm aiming to say here is I'm disclaiming any notion of prescience, but I certainly am very committed, and I've never run from a fight. I've never conceded to the possible, and at every point, at least in my career, I've been very eager to fight at the edge to expand the range of what is possible. And it takes some measure not only of sophistication and an awareness of history and theory, but also a little bit of, frankly, clever imagination. That's how we got the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal was a reflection of a creative response to the twin crises of mounting global climate catastrophe on the one hand, and our increasingly urgent economic crisis, which is placing so many Americans at risk of bankruptcy, of homelessness, of misery, and it takes that kind of innovative approach to sometimes very stale debates to break through, and that's very much a style that I want to continue emulating. Not just as an activist, but as a member of Congress. 10 years ago, I wrote a paper suggesting 18-year staggered terms for Supreme Court justices, which has become incredibly poignant in the wake of Justice Kavanaugh joining the bench. I fought the Kavanaugh nomination in 2006 to the DC Circuit, about 10 years before anybody knew who the man was. I mean, I've been fighting him his entire judicial career. And the granularity with which I've had an opportunity to fight some of these battles informs the creative sensibility with which I mean to address many of these crises. And I certainly appreciate the idea that people see in my history, and I hesitate to use the word inspiring, but a useful example. I certainly feel that when I look at Bernie, right? I might have a 20-year history of fighting for we the people in the face of government and corporate abuses. He's been doing it for twice as long as I have. So when I look at Bernie, I see the model. If anything, to me, the irony is that in 2019, there's an entire generation who agrees with me now. In the past, it frankly had never occurred to me as a viable track to run for office. When you talked about the tactical questions and the consideration of what is possible, in my past, in my 30s, it was not possible for someone like me to run for office, particularly because millennials hadn't matured yet and boomers still had control over the political process. But as the boomers transition and millennials take their place, millennials are already the largest generational voting bloc in the country. Millennials are already the most progressive generation the Republic has ever seen. I think that, one of the questions you asked me was, how do we shift to a country in which everyone is fighting for perhaps an intersectional vision of rights? And I think it's happening under our feet. And it's compelled not only by current events, not only by inspiring campaigns like Bernie 2020 and, other aspirers like the one that we're running, but also because generational change is inexorable. And by the time that transition is complete, I don't think anyone will recognize the political system that results. Young people across the board favor, for instance, not only debt-free college, which is something of a no-brainer, but also an expansive vision of human rights that would include not only emergency health services, not only fire services, not only roads, but also healthcare, housing, food. These are the opportunities we have in this generation, not only to guard and defend the human rights that are in crisis, but to boldly reclaim long established rights in other places that we have not been able to secure here in the United States. And that's ultimately what brings me to the race, not only a sense of dire crisis and the need to defend my neighbors and my republic from a continuing onslaught by a criminal president and complicit careerists who enable him, but also the opportunity to claim the future and to ensure that it meets the needs of working people and future generations instead of the corporations that have delivered our species to the brink.
Do you have much time left, Shahid?
I can talk for another couple of minutes. I probably have about 15 left.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for
and I want to repeat what Mike said just a couple minutes ago. After our first conversation, I was just, blown away because there's very few people that can just can really blend all these topics together and create a unified, coherent vision out of it, and one that's strong, left, full-throated, and it's incredible.
You're very kind. I'm humbled by the reflection and grateful for any opportunity that I can have to be helpful.
Yeah, let me just grab another question here. All One of the biggest things that we confront are the structural impediments to change within, electoral politics, right?
Yes.
Like, we could win a 60-40 election, and it's possible that the Senate shakes out in such a way that we can't get anything done. The one,
That's right.
And you talked about a generational change, and I agree with you. I believe that millennials and Gen Z or Zoomers are the most progressive generation of Americans ever. But are we going to be able to get it done in time? And what should we consider in building independent structures of power? What are your thoughts on that?
Great questions. Yeah, I mean, the one you raised about are we going to be able to flip the table in time and establish a new paradigm before the climate crisis grows so acute that
right.
Human life becomes imperiled. That is the $1 million question. That is the question that our generation confronts. And I'm not so inclined to prognosticate. I'm just going to jump on the scale with every ounce of energy that I have.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll leave it at that. And then there was another question that you raised separate from, are we going to get there in time? Can you remind me of that?
Which is just the structural impediment of the Senate.
Yes.
And what do you think about decisions like DC statehood, Puerto Rican statehood, some other
Nice.
short-term tactical moves we can do? And I hate to do the tactical guy, but
No, no.
it's kind of my ballyhook. So what do you think about stuff like packing the court, filibuster reform, the Senate reform, things like that?
Yeah, let's start with packing the court and DC statehood. I'll take those in inverse order. So I'm pleased to hear you raise DC statehood, because for the better part of 10 years, I was part of the DC statehood Green Party. And DC statehood was one of that party's central aims. And I would describe it not as a tactical reform to remedy a structural imbalance. It's a democratization imperative.
Right.
I mean, there are 500,000 people in the District of Columbia, and these are not generally government employees. I mean, we're talking about people maybe who work in service industries or people who work in any number of capacities who are denied any right to vote for a federal representative. And taxation without representation is alive and well in the United States. It applies to everyone who lives in the District of Columbia and everyone who ever has. When I moved back to California, each time that I've come back to California from Washington, I've celebrated the recovery of my voting rights as a not tongue-in-cheek celebration of rejoining the first world. A thing I just say with respect to DC statehood is that at the moment, it is nowhere on the table. It's not really mentioned in the debate very often. There was a proposed bill, I recall, I think it would have been 2007 or maybe 2008, the DC Voting Rights Act, or DC Vote, at least is the name of the organization that was supporting it. And this was a bill that would have given DC a single vote in the House, no senators, not statehood. And in order to make it politically palatable to a co-opted Congress, the bill would also have created a new House seat representing a conservative district. At the time, the census favored Utah because Utah was the next state that was in line for a representative. And so it was engineered explicitly to be neutral. It gets worse, though. You think that's bad? Worse than that is the first year that bill ever got a hearing in Congress was the very first year in its history that the District of Columbia was no longer majority black.
Right.
And
of course.
And that might sound really gross, and I can't necessarily establish causation that the gentrification of the district is what discreetly compelled Congress to finally consider giving DC residents voting rights. But correlation is established, and if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it might just be institutional racism embodied even in our congressional policymaking process.
Well, I mean, I'm slightly inclined to agree with that just on the basis of Republicans trying to get that census question just because they know it will depress certain demographics and give a slight edge to Republican seats.
Oh, and yeah. Just the other part of my question was your question of decolonization of Puerto Rico, whether to lean towards statehood or independence, and how you feel about that, especially in light of another hurricane, possibly having Puerto Rico as a target this year.
Yeah.
And then parallel structures of power and organizing, and how you see the labor movement as part of your campaign and larger progressive change within the country.
Okay, so we got Puerto Rico, the Supreme Court, and then the labor movement. Let's. I want to make
Pack
sure we
the
hit
court.
each.
Yeah. Sorry about
No, it's
that.
okay. We're stacking questions, but that's good. Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a territory that we have effectively abandoned in the wake of an ecological crisis there, in which our fossil fuel extractive industries and our military industrial complex has been thoroughly complicit for at least 70 years. So as we look, and I would say the same thing about Brazil, where an ecocide is underway,
Right.
with the CIA's support. And I hear a lot of climate justice people, alarmed about Brazil, and I hear not nearly enough of them drawing that focus and directing their ire at the criminal intelligence agency that helped put a fascist in power.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about Puerto Rican statehood, I would take my cue from the residents of the territory. And my understanding is that statehood, as much as I would wish it to be, is not a majority position in Puerto Rico. I think one reason for that might be because for 40 years, the FBI had a documented program to, this is a direct quote, neutralize voices on the island that sought independence from the U.S. And so it's hard to know whether or not contemporary polling results, in any way are legitimate, frankly, in the wake of that history.
Right.
But I would be certainly eager to support statehood if that was a position that was coming from the island. With respect to the Supreme Court, let's just pivot there. So a lot of people are concerned about the right-wing Supreme Court, and they should be, because it is going off the rails, and it will be, if we stay on the current track and do nothing to the nominations process and nothing to the structure of the court, it will be a generation before we're able to reclaim fair and unbiased jurisprudence.
Yeah.
And another way to put that is that the Supreme Court has been weaponized on behalf of corporations and government agencies, including police departments, and used as a lever to suppress the rights of the American people. And I could go into that for days, from the Shelby County decision, where the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act as unconstitutional, essentially inviting Republican state legislators and legislators to start attacking voting rights in the years since. Just to close the loop there, a lot of people are worried about election security and election hacking. You don't need a computer to hack an election. Republicans have used the law to hack elections since 2016, and the Supreme Court put them in a position to do it. Reproductive rights become an area where the Supreme Court's opportunity to shred the rights of Americans becomes all too stark and clear and looming. And I'm very concerned about attempts to enforce authoritarian control, either over dissent or family planning decisions, right? There's a litany of ways in which authoritarianism can emerge, and all of the powers are very much in place. All that said, with respect to the court, the founders of the country in the Federalist Papers, I think it was 49, where Hamilton describes the importance of the independence of the judiciary as a crux on which liberty rests. And if we aim to correct the pro-corporate judicial bias that currently infects the Supreme Court by replacing it with a different bias, we have done ourselves no favors. The way, I think, to release the court from its political co-optation is to reform the nominations process and the tenure from life tenure, which is what we have now, and packing the court is almost like a 1.0 linear way. If you concede life tenure, how do you balance the court? Well, let's expand the seats. And I would say a 2.0 more thoughtful way of achieving the same end is not to expand the number of seats, but rather to limit the tenure. 18-year staggered terms would ensure that every justice has plenty of opportunities to establish expertise. It would ensure that at any point in time, the court would have both experienced veteran composition as well as new blood. That's not something we can rely upon at the moment. It would also diminish the incentives for stealth nominees and young nominees who are effectively have been weaponized by their various sides to serve on the bench, for years and years and years. I mean, the Republican strategy recently has been to nominate people in their 40s and 50s to ensure that they might stay on the bench for 30 or 40 years. There's no reason we should concede that or accept that. Maybe the final thing I'd say here is that judicial ethics matter, even when ethics violations are committed by Supreme Court justices. There is currently no body situated to hold justices accountable for their ethical violations. That is unacceptable, and I would love to see Congress step into the breach there to enforce judicial ethics at a time when the Supreme Court justices appear to have effectively given themselves, infinite get out of jail free cards. And when you have people like Brett Kavanaugh, whose assaults include not only sexual assault and apparently lying to the people's representatives under oath, but there are lots of opportunities through the ethics process to hold justices accountable. And I go back to Justice Scalia when he was still with us, sitting in judgment, for instance, over the Bush-Cheney administration and a suit that sought access to the White House visitor logs. And, rather than recuse himself, as any justice concerned about ethics would do, Justice Scalia inappropriately sat on that case, despite having a personal relationship with Vice President Dick Cheney at the time. And this willingness to play loose with the rules and disregard ethics is a problem that I think we can address, in addition to imposing 18-year staggered terms to ensure turnover on a court that is otherwise inclined toward calcification.
If I remember correctly, wasn't Scalia also casually attending like Coke-funded organized
That's where he
groups
died.
and things like that?
That's where he died.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was even like this casual,
I believe.
Almost casual corruption or appearance of corruption.
Well, and on your point about the casual corruption, every right-wing justice who claimed to be a neutral umpire before the Senate Judiciary Committee in their confirmation hearings, only to then enact jurisprudence that is anything but neutral, every single one of those people lied in their confirmation hearings. That is an ethical violation. Good luck getting a non-politicized process to address that. But the point is, justices should at least feel heat when their commitments to the American people, when they have opportunities for transparency and accountability, when their representations to the people fly so baldly in the face of their subsequent acts. I think it's entirely appropriate for us to respond as a polity by limiting their tenure to diminish the extent to which they can effectively prey on the public using life tenure as a weapon.
Yeah, so I think we have run to the time you said you had with us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll keep you as long as you want to stay, because these are all favorite topics of mine.
You're definitely one of those people I feel like we could probably talk to for hours and still have hours more stuff to talk about. But always a pleasure having you, and hope to have you again soon.
Thank you so much. You're very kind. I appreciate it. Thanks for bringing me on. Keep up the great work. And I look forward to talking to you again.
And everybody, we will be putting information if you would like to help. I know a lot of people in the chat as we watched. I think we had about 400 live viewers during our interview today, so that's pretty good. Please go to his website. We're putting his Act Blue page. We're putting his website. Please get involved. You can help him no matter where you live in the world.
And if you're in the Bay Area, just reach out.
So thank you very, very much for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And I gotta say that the chat was incredibly excited to have you. So,
well, that's very kind. I appreciate the support, appreciate the forum, and I hope some of your listeners find their way to our campaign. We look forward to welcoming them.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Shahid.